Hello and welcome to another episode of the GCSUNScast. I'm your host Shane, and thanks for joining me on the Gold Coast Suns fan show. I'd like to start off by thanking our Patreon donors: Jack's dad, Dale Snelling, Paul Vosti, Robbie Fiorini, Brody Burgess, Kate Kelland, Chris Moore, Tom Kim and Tim. Thanks for joining us on Patreon. You can head over to patreon.com/GCSUNScast and show some support there. Otherwise, like, subscribe and review on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Spotify and wherever you like to get your podcasts from. Now, today's guest is co-host of AFL Exchange and journalist for AFL Media. Welcome to the show, Riley Beveridge.
Thank you for having me, Shane. Looking forward to it. I know you've had Mitch and Cal from AFL Exchange on before, so I was waiting for my call up, and I'm glad to be on.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully you won't disappoint us. Mitch and Cal were great, and I'm sure you will be too. Interesting timing for you to come onto the show, because you are a Blues supporter as well as... I believe you did purchase the Suns membership like the other boys did earlier this year, so you sort of got your foot in both sides of the game from the weekend. How did you think the Blues and the Suns game went?
Yeah, it was an interesting contest. I felt a bit for Gold Coast. I mean, it just looked like they were out on their legs, and that's what you can expect with a 4-day break into the game. I think it was their 5th game in 19 days. So I don't know about you, but I just felt they looked leggy right from the start, and obviously had that goalless opening term, and that sort of set the tone for the rest of the game. So hopefully they can rebound from that this week, because I just think they've been better than what they performed on Friday night, and I think it'd be really disappointing given they went up to Darwin. They've obviously got that partnership with Darwin now, and they'll have some academy prospects come through Darwin over the next couple of years. So I think they'll be disappointed with their showing up at TIO, but look, they're certainly on the right track, and I think they've got a really bright future at the club.
Yeah, I agree. It's not great watching the sort of football that was dished up. I thought it was a pretty poor game, the conditions. But Carlton were the ones that made the most of the sweaty, humid conditions, and they honestly looked like they controlled the ball very well, considering the Suns just couldn't lay their hands on it. You saw Jack Martin on the footage before the game started, and him and all the other boys were just so sweating so much, it looked like they jumped out of a pool.
Yeah, it was exactly like that. I actually think it took both sides probably a bit longer to adjust to the conditions than I thought it might. I mean, you almost had to play that game as though it was a wet weather, rainy game, just how much it was every player was sweating and the ball would have had sweat on it. And then also on the broadcast, they mentioned a couple of times that it was really dewy at the ground, on ground level. So I think it took both sides. I actually thought even Carlton tried to overpossess the footy a bit too much in the opening stages, and they were the sort of ones to figure it out the quickest in that second quarter and sort of start to move the ball and look for yardage and territory, as opposed to just trying to over-control it off half-back. So I was a bit surprised by how long it took the two sides to adjust the conditions, but as you mentioned, it wasn't a great spectacle. No,
it wasn't. And it wasn't helped by the Suns sort of not showing the energy that they've brought in previous games. The final score was Gold Coast Suns 4 goals 3-27, defeated by Carlton 7 goals 18-60. I don't know whether you want to comment on this, but the free kicks I thought were pretty consistent, but the hands in the back rule seem to have gone missing.
Yeah.
So that was a bit confusing, but at least it was consistent. I thought both sides had opportunities where they could have claimed hands in the back. And the 3 games in 9 days for the Suns, it was probably a telling performance if you look at that stat compared to the 21 days that Carlton had 3 games.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought, as I mentioned off the top, that's what I thought a pretty significant difference was. And I actually thought it was very noticeable even from the first quarter. I mean, you might have expected that they'd start strong but taper out, given it was, as you mentioned, the 3rd game in 9 days and the 5th game in 19 days. But they looked leggy right from the start, Gold Coast, and I thought Carlton got the jump on them there. But, I mean, do you balance it out by the fact that maybe, like, Carlton did go from, I think they were from Queensland to WA, they hubbed in WA, they went back to Queensland, then they went to Darwin in that 19-day stretch as well. So, look, it's a really unique season, and I'm not actually sure whether or not travel takes it out as much as it might have in previous seasons when you don't have to do it as much, or if those games in the condensed days is actually the bigger factor there. I thought from Friday night, the games in condensed days was a much bigger factor than travel, just in terms of how tired Gold Coast looked right from the outset. And you expect that with younger bodies, and they've still got a lot of younger players. And I think that's the sort of misconception about Carlton. They're actually a very experienced and older team with a lot of older heads in that side. I mean, look at Cade Simpson and Ed Curnow, Mark Murphy. Mark Murphy was probably best on ground for the Blues. So a lot of experience in that side who are used to that sort of having the travel through their legs. So Gold Coast, they'll sort of adjust to that. I think it'll be a good learning curve for them in terms of how they prepare going forward, especially if they have a run like this in the future, which you probably wouldn't expect them to have such a severe run of 5 games in 19 days, though.
No, I hope we don't see anything like that again as far as the intensity. I don't mind the footy frenzy, maybe 2 or 3 rounds condensed into 2 weeks. But, yeah, it was probably a bit much. Jack Martin made his return against the Suns for the first time since he left in contentious style. He played a pretty good game for Jack Martin, I thought. Just over the 20 disposals. He seemed to have an impact, but at the same time, I was still impressed with the likes of Buderick, Ballard and Powell curbing the influence of Betts and Martin in that game. And Lukosius and Ainsworth looked really strong when they went forward.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, you mentioned Connor Buderick there. He's one that I watched him actually quite a fair bit at junior level last year and was quite impressed by him, knowing that he was a Gold Coast product. He sort of flirted with being a midfielder in his junior season, but he's sort of adapted to that small defender role really well. And I mean, there's been a lot of positives for Gold Coast this year. I know it's tapered off sort of the last 6 weeks, but there's been a lot of positives, and I actually think he's been one of the more underrated ones. He got that Rising Star nomination early in the season, and I actually think it's very hard to find small defenders who you can lock in each and every week, because you don't go out and think, I'm going to draft a small defender with a first-round draft pick. It's just sort of almost like an afterthought. You tend to get them with later picks. I mean, you look at the best small defenders in the game over the years, guys like Nick Smith at Sydney and Neville Jetta at Melbourne. None of them have been high draft picks, so it's actually hard to lock down and find one that's going to be a consistent player for a long period of time. And I think Connor Buderick's certainly one that Gold Coast has on their hands, and they'll be hoping he can be a 200-game player now, I reckon. Yeah,
they definitely will. He's come along in leaps and bounds, and he's filling a position the Suns have really struggled with since they came into the competition. Small forwards have always seemed to get the better of the Suns, and we've never really had the answer. Betts has been one of those players that has made life hell for Suns. And you guys on AFL Exchange look like you're going to have a segment next week about players that have had the best of an opposition team. I think Eddie Betts against the Suns, his track record would prove that he's probably up there.
Well, he threatened as well on the weekend. There was a couple of moments where the ball, maybe it was that slippery ball, just slipped through his hands, and he had a couple where he was trying to run rings around players on the boundary line. He threatened it, but I think Connor probably did enough to negate his influence on the contest in the end. Yeah,
with the help of Charlie Ballard as well. I think they really curbed his influence, which could have been deadly if Betts got on the run. A number of criticisms from that game for the Suns. They just weren't in it, I think, contested-wise or uncontested. Carlton had 95 more disposals, 7 more clearances, 27 more inside 50s. It wasn't a great look for the Suns and what we've seen from them. And all 4 goals came from the back half. Usually we get those goals coming from stoppages, but all 4 of those goals came from generating run off the back half with the help of Lukosius. So definitely a change in the way that the Suns would normally play, and you probably put that down to them being tied combined with Carlton really doing their homework and stopping the Suns from doing what they do best.
Well, yeah, I found that interesting, and a couple of points you raised there in terms of all 4 of their goals coming from the back half. I reckon that's pretty unsustainable. Football's become, over the last 3 or 4 years, a real forward half game and a forward 50 game where you look at the best sides like Richmond and their ability to pressure inside 50. And I've just found it interesting that I reckon that's an area Stuart Dew's particularly targeted the last couple of weeks. Like Alex Sexton, for example, him getting drops and coming out of this side, I mean, obviously he's a pretty consistent goal kicker and he's proved that over a long period of time, but just the forward pressure's been non-existent on occasions from Sexton, and the fact that he's out of the team suggests to me that that's an area that Stuart Dew wants to prioritise, and he's trying to make a point and saying, look, you can kick all the goals that you want, but if you're not going to apply this forward 50 pressure, you're not going to be in the side. So I found that really interesting, his omission over the last couple of weeks, and I think that's probably why. He's probably trying to put a focus on scoring from inside 50, and the fact that they weren't able to do that against Carlton is probably a worry for him, I reckon.
Yeah, there's been a few players rotating through that section of the ground. Darcy McPherson hasn't had a look in for a few weeks now as well, and that was an area that he excelled in. Sean Lemons has been in and out of the side. The Suns are just struggling to get that consistency in that part of the ground, which they thrived early in the season with. So it's going to be interesting to see how they pull up and how they go forward. I think that probably brings me to another AFL Exchange segment that I'd like to bring up with the help of you, Riley. Things that should happen. So we're going to do a Gold Coast Suns themed things that should happen. And I think it's time that the Suns allow some of the fringe players a chance to have a look at the AFL side. Peter Wright hasn't played a game all season. Will Brodie hasn't played since round one. There's just a lot of talent sitting there that could come in and maybe not necessarily have an impact straight away because the lack of practice matches has really hampered development, I think. But give them a chance to gain some sort of form heading into the end of the season.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, there's been a couple, and I think, like, look, you mentioned a couple there, like Will Brodie and Peter Wright, and I agree they're obviously high picks and highly rated young players, but I think that's a testament to Gold Coast's depth and their growing depth this year. They haven't got a game, which is a good thing, but I agree. I mean, especially now, you'd have to think there's going to be suitors for both of those players, particularly in Victoria. They're both Victorian prospects at the end of the year. If they're not getting a game, there might be clubs who want to give them a second chance at AFL level at the trade table later this year. I think if you're a Gold Coast, if you're part of Gold Coast at the moment, you just got to find out if these players, you've got to give them a sink or swim period. You've got to say, look, you've got the last 4 games now. Go out there, show us why you should have an extended career with us. Otherwise, it might be in Gold Coast's best interest to find Peter Wright a new home at the end of the year, for example, and sort of say, what can we recoup from Peter Wright? Can we get an early-ish pick back in return for him and try and invest that in some other way? Because, I mean, he's not helping him in the reserves at the moment, and he's certainly a player with highly rated talent. I reckon if I was to give you the things that should happen, I don't know how you feel about this, but my thing for Gold Coast that should happen, I wouldn't give up on finals just yet. And I know it's a long way back, and Gold Coast probably have to win their last 4 games to make finals or to even give themselves a shot. But there's very winnable games in these next 4 or 5 weeks for the club. So North Melbourne and Hawthorn, you'd probably pencil them in as favourites. Collingwood, probably without Steele's side bottom, they'll still have no Jordan De Goey, no Jeremy Howe. They're gettable, and North Melbourne went with him for a half last night. So there's no reason why they couldn't beat Collingwood on their day. And I know Brisbane's a tough game, and they're going to be among the premiership fancies, but I honestly think that anything can happen in those Q clashes, and with the intensity and with the rivalry that they've built over the last 6 or 7 years, if you get a bit of a run on, you beat North Melbourne, you think to yourselves, right, let's give ourselves a chance. And in the end, you might win 4 games to end the season and still not make it, but the pressures involved in a finals campaign and having a finals chase like that will be invaluable for these young players going forward. So I get your point in terms of maybe giving some fringe players a go to end the season, but I reckon there'd be a part of Stuart Dew that'd be thinking in his mindset, no, you know what, we've done the hard work, let's unleash our players and say, give it a red-hot crack, try and win our next couple and see where it leaves us with a fortnight to go in the season.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they did that. We've seen over the last footy frenzy that they haven't taken the opportunity to rest players when they could have. And that's honestly surprised me. I think they've used 32 players throughout the whole year when they've had plenty of opportunity to rest a bunch throughout the footy frenzy and rotate players through. But they seem to be very much of the mindset, put our best side out in the park at all times. So if they were to continue doing that and push for finals, I wouldn't be against it. I see it a bit unlikely, So, but it's good to hear some positivity from you, Riley, about the Suns. So, yeah, let's keep bringing it on. All right, so want to ask you some of your memorable moments with the Suns. Have you reported on anything or interviewed any of the players or staff that sort of stood out to you as something that was pretty special?
Well, I think you mentioned off the top that I'm a Gold Coast member this year. And I'd say a memorable moment is probably the reason for that is that I think I was speaking to Craig Cameron, obviously Gold Coast list manager, at the end of last season on air on AFL.com.au's draft show, and actually told him that if they went out and had a bold trade period and got something along with, because I think at that stage we all knew that Rowell and Anderson were going to be Suns, but I wanted to see them just be daring. They just got that compensation package from the AFL, and I wanted to see the club sort of say, no, you know what, look, we're going to try and fast track this. This is how we're going to do it. And just a couple of trades that they made in terms of getting Sam Flanders to the club, who I love, and I couldn't believe he slipped to where Gold Coast managed to get him at last year's draft. I thought he'd be a top 5 pick for sure, because he's got I don't want to say he is like Dustin Martin, but he's like those Dustin Martin, Christian Petrarca type of players where it wouldn't surprise me if at his best in 3 or 4 years' time he's bursting through the midfield and then just going to the goal square and just playing as that deep one-out forward. And he's the type of player that is very hard to match up on with his size, and he's very lethal around goal. He showed that in the NAB League last season. So I was wrapped they went out and got him. And then the next day, just taking their chances and giving up that pick 11 for Jeremy Sharp. I wasn't as high on Jeremy Sharp as other players in the draft. I didn't necessarily think that he was worth the trade that they gave up and the pick 11 they gave up for him. But just the fact that they went out and did it and said, no, look, we rate this player highly. We've done the scouting on him. We trust our judgment on this, and we're going to go out and make a really bold move. I love that. And that's ultimately why I ended up becoming a Suns member, because I had the chat with Craig Cameron the next day and said, no, you know what, I'm going to follow through on it. I really like what you did.
Yeah, you got to respect the balls to make gut trades like that. They'd just been handed pick 11 for next year, was it? And a whole bunch of other picks, and it surprised a few that they gave up so much for some of these players. I think with the exception of Sam Flanders, we all knew Sam Flanders had the potential to be a star. And I was surprised Sydney passed on him at 5. But, the Jeremy Sharp one took a few by surprise. But from all reports, he's come into the club and he's really delivered. They love what he's doing. And we saw a bit of him in the pre-season, and he really looked to set the world on fire when he did come on and provide the Suns with something that they had lacked up until this year, which was a genuine winger. So it was good to see him come in, and I agree that the drafting movements in the last 12 months has been sensational. You also look at the blokes like Hugh Greenwood as well, you know, what they've been able to get out of him and out of Brandon Ellis. Would you say Brandon Ellis has had a career best year?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, I think he's really flourishing from an individual point of view through in that inside role. I mean, he played so often on a halfback flank and on a wing for Richmond. I think since he's made the move to a pure on ball and he can win more of the contested ball, I think he's showing what he can do in that area. The other thing that I just wouldn't, there's so many, and obviously Hugh Greenwood, I mean, you know what you're going to get each and every week from Hugh Greenwood in terms of just his ability to back up, butter up, go to every contest, lay 10 tackles a game. So, but it's the intangibles you get from players like that. And I think that actually started 12 months earlier when the club got Anthony Miles and George Horn-Smith through the door. And I know they haven't played much footy over the last 12 months, but they provide so much leadership. And I think Stuart Dew often references just how much Hugh Greenwood has provided to the younger players in an off-field sense. And I think Brandon Ellis, being a 2-time premiership player, even though he probably hasn't been name-checked as much by Stewie Dew, I think he'd be doing the exact same thing. He's been to the big stage. He knows what it takes. He knows the training standards that it takes to be a genuine premiership contender. So I think the intangibles you get from those two are huge as well. And yes, they went out and offered them long-term deals when their respective clubs might not have been able to, but ultimately it's proving worth it. And you can probably speak to that as much as I can, because I'm sure watching them with the lens that you watch those two players each and every week, you'd know just how consistent and how reliable they've been in that inside midfield role. Yeah,
I never understood why Brandon Ellis was the whipping boy at Richmond, but he's come up to the Suns and really starred. He does his role, he does his job, and he also brings a youthful enthusiasm to the team. I understand that prior to Brandon Ellis going there, people were taking the football too seriously, and Brandon Ellis coming there and sort of bringing that larrikin vibe has really sort of opened up the club, and they're really enjoying their football a lot more, which is showing on the field. As for Hugh Greenwood, yeah, I was blown away when I first saw him playing for the Suns in the preseason. Just his ability to get the ball up above his shoulders, and withstand a tackle enough to get the ball out, which is something the Suns had lacked from day one. I mean, Gary Ablett did that sort of stuff, but in his own sort of unique way, which was just mind-blowing. But Hugh Greenwood does it the old-fashioned grunt way, and I just love what he brings. And then Matt Rowell turned around and started doing it as well, and I thought, this is amazing, the sort of characters we've just got in the space of one draft.
And the thing about Hugh Greenwood, which I wouldn't underestimate as well, is just how much Adelaide has missed him this year. And he's probably a player that Crows fans wouldn't have said that they'd miss when he left the club. But you look at their young midfielders they're trying to bring through at the moment, and you almost need that buffer player, that protector who can really do the defensive work that you mentioned and has that defensive two-way mindset. I reckon he'd be so invaluable for players like Noah Anderson, who's that more attack-minded midfielder, blokes like Sam Flanders when they go through there. I think he'd be great for them in terms of he's providing it. He's doing the stuff that they now no longer have to do. They'll do that in time, so they'll become those two-way runners who lay 10 tackles a game. But you don't want to have to expose younger bodies to doing that as early as they are in their careers. And Hugh Greenwood's providing them that with that buffer, and I think that's something that Adelaide's missed so much this year as well. Yeah,
completely agree. And if we had Hugh Greenwood 7, 8, 9 years ago when the Suns started, the midfield development that would have come from the likes of Prestia and O'Meara and the others, it would have excelled them, their development by so much, having that big-bodied in there, because the Suns just constantly got beaten up in the early years in that midfield.
Completely agree.
All right, so what's your favourite Suns win that you've seen?
I'm going to have to avoid saying the Jack Bowes goal with about 3 seconds to go, just from my own perspective. It was a heartbreaking day for me. My favourite Suns win is actually, I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 2017 or 2018, I think. But the victory over Sydney at the SCG, when I think Gold Coast had about 8 or 9 of its top 10 of its best and fairest out from the year before. They hadn't won a game in a long time, and they went out there and I think they were 5 goals down early in the contest as well, and they came out and really provided a really morale-boosting win. It was early in Stewie Jew's tenure. I just thought that was one of the greatest upsets of that particular season, and probably one of the greatest upsets in recent modern footy. But the way they were able to apply themselves, I think that's the first time you really got a sense that the club was heading in the right direction. I think it's built steadily from there.
Yeah, it has. That was definitely a special win for Suns fans. We never thought we'd had a chance of winning that game, and then Thompson comes out, keeps Franklin goalless. We see Archie really outrunning Franklin in the back half to get the ball. The desperation they showed, and to come back from the 4 or 5 goals down they were at quarter time, and pip the Swans, who at that stage were still gunning for a final spot, I believe. It was a very, very impressive win for the Suns. So who would your favourite player be?
I'm a big Noah Anderson fan. So Noah's my boy at the moment. Me and Cal have fought long and hard over Noah over the last sort of 12, 18 months, because Cal reckons in his role as the draft guru that he was the first to identify him. But I know Matt Rowell's a gun, and I've got no doubts about Matt Rowell and what he's going to be, but it just wouldn't shock me if in 5 or 6 years' time, Noah Anderson at least gets close to Matt Rowell, if not is better than Matt Rowell in 5 or 6 years' time. I think he's got that ability to be a real sort of 25-2 goal player every week. So I love what he's been able to do this year. I think his year's actually been pretty underrated given the limelight that Matt got earlier in the season. I think he's actually gone under the radar a little bit, but he's my man, and I reckon he's going to be an A-grade player for a very long time.
Yeah, and we've started to see Anderson get more midfield time at attending centre bounces late in games, and he's really having an impact. I think it was the Richmond game. I would have had Anderson as one of our best on field, right next to Lukosius. He's really, really coming into his own, and you're right, he's gone under the radar. Matt Rao took away all the spotlight off him at the start, and then as soon as Matt Rao goes out, Isaac Rankin comes in and takes all the spotlight, and now it's Anderson's time to shine. Do you think he's any chance of winning the Rising Star?
I think he is. To be honest, I wouldn't surprise me if Ben King won now at the moment, just the form he's been able to show pretty consistently. I think the other thing with Anderson, which is why he's gone under the radar, I think his best footy sort of coincided with his last 5 or 6 week stretch where Gold Coast probably hasn't been winning as many games as they did at the start of the year. So they're probably not drawing as much attention as what they were at the start. But I definitely think he's in with a chance of the Rising Star. I hope they note that. I hope the judges note his consistency across the entirety of the season, because I think that's probably what's on his side from a certain perspective. I've got to say though, a close second, and I thought he was Gold Coast's best on Friday night, is Jack Lukosius. I'd be keen to get your take on this. Do you think he could go into the midfield one day? He's got I know he's drafted as a 40. He's got such a lethal kick from half back, which is probably where he's best suited to set up the play. But there are times when he steps forward and plays in a higher role that he almost reminds me of Scott Pendlebury in the way that he has just such innate time with the footy, and then he's able to deliver it with such composure. I don't know. He's got a weird sort of body size to be a midfielder. I think his body size might work against him, whether or not he has the endurance base, or whether or not Gold Coast would even want to move him from half back now. But I just see some of the things he does and thinks, geez, if he could even spend 50% of a game in the midfield and be that, if he could get his hands on the footy 20 or 25 times every week. I mean, if you're an opposition coach, the one thing you don't want is Jack Lukosius kicking the ball 20 times every game, because you know it's hitting a target.
Yeah, exactly. His last 2 matches, I think the Richmond game, he had almost cracked, I think he was just under 1,000 metres gained, which I'm not sure if that's some sort of record, but it's got to be close. And this game against Carlton in these sort of conditions, I think he had another 800 metres gained. He's deadly with the ball, and his kicks, we've seen his kicks, he can pinpoint targets 50, 60 metres down the ground. I think the club would be crazy to move him off half back. I think he's a best distributor that the club has, and only in his second year, probably one of our better ball users. As far as playing midfield, I think he's got potential. Definitely maybe play him on a wing. I guess it just depends on personnel and where they can fit him in. He could be that sort of utility player that can just play all 3 positions of the ground. Yeah, so,
100%. And that's the thing as well. Like the Gold Coast, as I said, they might not want to move him from half back just because of how damaging he is there. And I mean, he might not have the endurance base to play midfield, which is fair enough. He might not have just that innate ability to find the footy 20 times from the midfield. So I think you're probably best off for the moment, at least for the foreseeable future, keep him in half back, just because he is such a lethal kick.
It will be interesting to see if they ever decide to move him back down into the forward line now that he's sort of grasped the speed of the game, which I think he really struggled with in his first few games down forward. But it's a weird one. Like Ben King was drafted as a key defender, and now he's a key forward and probably rivaling his brother Max King.
Yeah, completely agree. And he's been certainly, I mean, there's been a lot of positives, as I've already mentioned, but he's been among them throughout the year. So, yeah, no, I completely agree. It's a hard one. They've got a lot of versatile players, and that's probably a good headache to have if you're Stuart Dew.
Yeah, it absolutely is. All right, so another question I wanted to bring up, seeing just before the lead up to the Darwin game, all the stuff the Suns were doing to promote the game up there, Cyril Rioli joined in, and I've also heard reports that apparently he was training with the Suns. If Cyril Rioli was to return, as we've all talked about how good it would be to see him back in the AFL, do you think he could be a Sun?
I don't now. I think the ship might have sailed with Cyril. It'd be an unbelievable story, but at 31, he's been out of the game for a while now. I don't think he could come back and play footy just yet. It was good to see him, as you mentioned, join the club and speak to a couple of the players before that game. I think he might have even presented a jumper. So it was awesome to see that, and great to see him back in the AFL spotlight because he is such a treasure to our game. So, as much as I'd love to dream, and I can't imagine a forward line with Cyril Rioli in his peak next to Isaac Rankin in his peak. That'd be an absolute nightmare for defenders, but I can't imagine it happening.
Yeah, that's certainly a tantalising prospect. But no, in all seriousness, I think Cyril's probably done with his playing career. However, I can quite easily see him continue on a nurturing sort of role, developing the kids up there in the territory and working with whichever club has the allowances to work with the territory, at the moment being the Suns. We don't know how long that will continue for, but having Cyril Rioli work with the kids will certainly bring out the best in them and give them every chance to succeed at AFL level. Okay, so with news over the last week, Rory Thompson has done a partial tear in his ACL. It's his third knee reconstruction in probably just as many years, I think. Yeah. You would think it would probably be the end of his career. He's been with the club since day one and got to be around 30, I would say. So we don't see too many players come back from a third knee reconstruction at 30 years of age.
No, we don't. It'd be such a massive shame if it was. I think he's still, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he might still be contracted.
I think he's contracted for another year or two, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure on that. It's off the top of my head. But yeah, it is such a shame because he can be such an important player and you need that big body. I mean, they've coped pretty well down there without him, in the sense that Charlie Ballard, as you mentioned, has come along as a really important defender down there. Jack Lukosius is able to play tall. So they've coped okay. But yeah, there's been a couple of those players, like Sam Day's another one who's missed a lot of footy down the journey. So and has been a long servant at Gold Coast. So it is a real shame for him. Hopefully he gets his career back on track, because I'm sure for someone like yourself, Shane, who's been a Gold Coast fan since day one, you must have some sort of sentimental attachment to those sort of players who've been there from the start, and you must want to see them be part of this club's success, because you got to imagine that success is just going to be around the corner for this team, given how much talent is on the list now. You'd love to see someone like Rory Thompson there to enjoy that.
Yeah, I would. Rory Thompson, he's been an underrated defender in most of his years when he was playing, but he's always struggled with injury. I think he's only played a full season once in his 10 years now in the AFL, but he's certainly proven that he can match it with the best forwards. Yeah, I'm not sure he does come back from this. It's a long way and it's very challenging, but all the best to Rory, and I hope we do see him again in Suns colours. Other news from the AFL or the Suns this week is we've had to make a couple of staff cuts, so has the entire competition, but the surprising move of letting go of Dean Solomon and Sean Hart in particular, along with Prescott and Malcheski, and Andrew Swallow, is interesting, because Dean Solomon's rated as one of the best senior assistant coaches. He was just missed out on the job for Fremantle last year. What do you make of the Solomon issue? I've heard reports that his salary is quite inflated, and that may be the reason they decided to let him go, because it's probably worth the equivalent of 2 assistant coaches, but it seems like a strange move to let go of someone so highly touted as Dean Solomon.
Yeah, there's been a couple of ex-players who have obviously come out and suggested that he did wonders for their careers, and he was such a loyal servant to that club for such a long period. It is a shame, and it's just a shame at what's happening given the pandemic that we've gone through, what's happening across clubs throughout the competition, and Gold Coast obviously acted with that. I think Fremantle made a couple of staff cuts in the last couple of days to their assistant coaching panel. So it is a shame. I think we might see a bit more of it going forward as clubs sort of take stock of what the soft cap cuts mean for them on an individual basis. So, but yeah, I'd be surprised if Dean Solomon didn't find a home elsewhere going forward. I'm sure it's probably pricked the interest of a lot of clubs across the country in terms of, well, this is someone who's got knowledge of being an assistant for such a long time and such a senior assistant who's sort of so highly rated and a lot of respect among the competition. So, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if he found somewhere else going forward, and if there's a few clubs that are weighing up whether or not they've got a place in their coaching backroom staff for Dean Solomon.
Yeah, and Sean Hart is an interesting one as well. He's the head of the player welfare, and that's something the Suns have really put a lot of resources in over the last couple of years. And from my understanding and my discussions with players' families and stuff, he's been a crucial part to the players feeling like their whole families are included in the Suns club. That is baffling to me, just the impact from my understanding of what Sean Hart has brought. But obviously the club are aware that they've had to make the hard decisions, and they must feel like they've got contingencies in place to continue the good work that he set up. So it'll be interesting to see how we go with that.
Yeah, it is just such a heartbreaking time. Like, I'm sure in an ideal world, Gold Coast wouldn't make any of these changes and they'd keep going forward and build on the promising sort of footstones that they've made this year. It is such a tough time across the entirety of the AFL industry.
Yeah, and heart goes out to all the people affected by this. I know you probably know a few people that have been affected by this as well, Riley being in the AFL media. So hopefully things turn around quickly. But our next story topic is another issue with the impact of COVID, and that is the AFL has decided to merge the NEAFL with the VFL. So from my understanding, I'm waiting for Cal Toomey to get back to me about this, but I'm off the understanding that includes Southport and Aspley and Redland, Canberra. So it looks like all the NEAFL clubs could be joining into a super competition in the VFL. Yeah,
it certainly appears that way. Again, I haven't done much research on this over the last couple of days, so I'm not 100% sure on the details, but it certainly does appear that they'll be given the option to if they wish to. And there's a bit of talk around Redland today. I saw some stories about them. So it'll be interesting to see how it all pans out and how it works. I mean, there's probably a few questions that still need to be resolved in terms of what it actually means for travel, because, I mean, you'd hope that clubs would return to the normal sort of fly-in, fly-out model as of 2021. And if that is the case, whether or not Gold Coast reserve team plays like say they have the game against Carlton on the weekend and it's in Victoria, for example, it might be at the MCG, whether or not the whole of Gold Coast squad travels down to Melbourne to play Carlton's reserves team, or whether or not they prioritise Queensland-based sides playing as many games as possible against fellow Queensland-based sides to eradicate the travel and expenses there. So I think there's a few questions that still need to be answered there, and I think that'll probably get worked through in due course.
Yeah, I did see a report, I'm not sure how accurate it is, but talking about the AFL is supposedly promised to pay for flights for the NEAFL clubs, the Queensland-based clubs, and I'd say the New South Wales clubs, Canberra and everything. And you'd think then logic comes into place where if Carlton's playing Gold Coast, then the Carlton reserve side is at Northern Bullants.
Well, they've actually they've split the alliance there, so Carlton's still working through what they do going forward. Obviously, no VFL season this year, but my understanding of it at the moment is that Carlton will have a standalone VFL side as of next year. So
the VFL's still in a bit of flux as well. So we don't know how many sides are going to be in the VFL next year either.
No, the VFL's in a pretty weird state of flux as well. So Carlton was obviously the headline in terms of breaking allegiances with the Northern Blues, which they'd had for a very long time. They were previously the Northern Bullants and the Preston Bullants, but they sort of split their alignment there. And while the club's still sort of working through what it takes, what next step it takes in terms of their VFL alignment, but it looks like it's going to probably be a standalone side. Again, it's not confirmed, but that appears the way it's going.
Interesting. So, stay tuned to that. I'm sure the AFL website will have plenty of news as it comes to light on the what the future of the second-tier competition for the NEAFL and the VFL will look like. That's it for all we have time for today. Thanks for joining me, Riley. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
No, thank you for having me on, Shane. It's been a great joy. I've really enjoyed watching Gold Coast this year, and hopefully for your sake, because I know you've been a long-suffering supporter who's been through the bad years, but hopefully there's better years to come, and judging by what the club's managed to do over the last 12 to 18 months, and even before that, because there are players like, well, I know we mentioned Jack Bowes before, but there are players like Jack Bowes who've been there longer than just the last 2 or 3 years, and Braden Ainsworth and players like that. So, Ben Ainsworth, sorry, I should say. I got my West Coast confused with my Gold Coast there. But, there are players that have been there for longer than that, 2 or 3 years. So hopefully the success is just around the corner, and everything is rosy from here on in for Stuart Dew and the club.
Yeah, I certainly hope so too, as do all other Suns fans, and probably the entirety of the AFL public wanting to see a competitive Gold Coast Suns side. Anyway, that's it for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Go Suns!